Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Richard, today we're going to talk about the mental health argument, the mental health issue associated with mass shootings and gun violence. And yesterday we talked about gun control, but today we're sort of we are within our wheelhouse today, talking about mental health. However, as people will soon hear, I think that there's a lot of issues as it relates to this issue as well.
That's right. The shooting that occurred last week in South Florida, last Wednesday, is still very much in the news. Mm-hmm. We are beginning to enter the second phase of the discussion. The first phase is shock, of course, and blame.
Right.
We're entering the second phase where things are beginning to cool down just a little bit. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing this time, two things, is that people are beginning to say this is a complex issue. Mm-hmm. There are many pieces, there are many facets to this issue, and we said that last week,
right.
That there are many facets to this issue, and there isn't a single one that's preeminent.
Right.
There's gun control, there's mental illness, there are a number of facets and each one needs to be explored. Right. And as we said yesterday, the gun control issue is one of those 5 or 6 issues. But in itself is a very complex issue, right. And we're going to see the same thing with mental illness today. Mm-hmm. It's another facet of a complex issue, but it too is very complicated and complex. Right. There is no simple answer. Just as there is no simple answer for gun control, you're going to hear this morning, there's no simple answer for mental illness. Right. It's a complex problem with many facets.
Right. Yeah, and there's another example of you mentioned yesterday that this feels a little bit different. This shooting feels a little bit different. And there's been protests.
Those protests by the
walkouts.
Kids.
Yeah.
They which shocked me because we've been talking about this generation, and this generation would be iGen, not millennials. I mean,
right.
I guess
they're
a little bit behind the iGen. And we've been very worried about this generation of them being self-centered and not concerned. And suddenly you see this public outcry by teenagers saying, somebody please do something. They're not in a position to do anything, but they are raising a voice, and it's a voice that's going to be heard. Somebody mentioned yesterday that Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. During the Vietnam War, his son brought war protesters who slept in his house and then went out in the morning and protested against the very war that he was responsible for. Right. Which meant that he was honoring his son's opinion, sons and his son's friends, while he was prosecuting this war that nobody wanted. And maybe he didn't even want it, but he was in that position, he had to do it. And I think what you're going to see now, and what some of the pundits said yesterday, is that you're now going to have the children of politicians who have been backing gun control and voting in favor of NRA policies. Their children are going to come into the House, and they're going to be raising serious questions. So this outcry from the I generation, somebody called them millennials, and I'm not sure
they're too young to be millennials.
They're too young to be millennials. So this iGen has raised this new voice. Yeah. You saw the 17 protesters at the White House, were lying down on the sidewalk. So that kind of demonstration was unexpected. And especially unexpected from this generation.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it does feel different, and it's moving slightly different in a slightly different direction.
Something about this is different. I thought it was going to be the first graders at Sandy Hook, because they were so innocent. I don't know what it is about this one, but hopefully the outcry will continue.
Right. But as we mentioned, as we were getting started, we're going to talk today about mental health, because I think that what we've heard this time, and we've heard in just about every previous mass shooting, it always comes back to mental health. And they say, well, this person was, the president will come on and say, well, this person was clearly mentally ill, or this person was obviously mentally deranged, or they were this or that. So often deflecting to a mental illness.
Right.
And so it is certainly something that's critical that we talk about, because I think that is a very easy thing to say, because for people who don't kill people, it's very clear to look at someone who does kill people and say there is something wrong with that person. Right. There's something mentally wrong with that person for them to be able to do that. And certainly they're correct, because
they might be correct.
Well, there's something going on upstairs in their brain to get them to that point, and they have to think differently. And you're right; it doesn't have to be a mental illness, but it is clear that person thinks differently than the general population if they are able to do something like that. Mm-hmm. Whether they're religious zealots, like you mentioned yesterday, right. the guys from 9/11, they think very differently, right. even than most Muslims. Mm-hmm. They think very differently, and so they would act in that way. Mm-hmm. But we very easily and quickly go to mental illness as though that is that's the elephant in the room. Right. And the data doesn't necessarily support that, for one, and for two, we never really talk about what the implications are if we go that road anyways. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with the statistics. You mentioned them yesterday.
Right, the 7.5.
Right,
7.5%. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because for some people, mental illness is going to be the issue. Right, they're going to say, no, this is about mental illness.
Right.
Period. It's not about guns. It's mm-hmm. about mental illness. It's about mental illness. But in fact, only 7.5% of these shootings are done by people who have a diagnosed mental illness.
At the time of the shooting.
Right. Harris and Klebold come to mind. Mm-hmm. They were I think both were treated for depression.
Right.
And ADHD. And so that came out after the fact. We didn't know that prior to, because of HIPAA and other regulations. Right. You're not allowed to know those. Right. Most people aren't allowed to know those things. And so, but the statement is always made after the fact.
Right.
As soon as this is one of the knee-jerk reactions, mm-hmm. is, well, that person is obviously mentally ill.
Right.
First thing out of mm-hmm. that some people will say. And that's an argument. It's fallacious.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fallacy there. Okay?
Right.
Just because a person has committed this horrific act,
right.
doesn't necessarily mean that they're mentally ill.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We do a lot of forensic work, and
right.
I've worked in jails and prisons, and I've worked with a lot of defendants, mm-hmm. and I have certainly evaluated my fair share of people who have committed horrible crimes, right.
Mm-hmm.
up to and including murder and all, and premeditated, intentional right. murder, and there have been a pretty good proportion of them have no mental illness
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
per se. I mean, no identifiable mental impairment,
right.
That you can sort of say, well, this explains why mm-hmm. he or she did what they did.
That's right. Just because a person commits a horrific act mm-hmm. does not necessarily mean they are mentally ill.
Right.
And some people will argue that. Well, no, you're obviously mentally ill.
Right.
No, you're not obviously mentally ill. You might be, but we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or we didn't know ahead of time
right.
that you might be. That's one problem.
Right.
So that not all people who kill are mentally ill.
Right. Okay. The other side of that is that most people, the vast majority of people who have a mental illness, mental health problem, don't ever
Right.
commit violent crimes.
They're not any more dangerous than the average person.
Right. So the problem of looking at mental illness or mental health issues as something associated with as a solution
Right.
to mass shootings and gun violence has problems on both sides of the fence.
Right. And what we would say and we've just certainly discussed this over the many years,
Right.
because we didn't just start talking about this last week.
Right.
I've been talking about this for 20 years or 15
Right.
years. If you say mental illness, I would say the first thing is which mental illness.
Right.
Okay? Because a person with ADHD, there are millions of people with ADHD who don't commit murder.
Right.
So when you say a mental illness, they're mentally ill. What do you mean? What do we mean by
Right.
they're mentally ill?
Right. And when you think about ADHD, when you think about depression, when you think about anxiety, you're talking about three of the most prevalent
That's right.
mental illnesses, mental health problems that in society that affect anywhere from up to about 20% of the population.
That's right.
And
That's right.
and so and that's 20% of the population at any given time. So that means that at the current prevalency rates, the current trends suggest that 50% of the population, half of us, will suffer from some mental health problem.
That's right.
At some point in our life.
That's right. What if you're 20 years old and you want to go into the Air Force?
Right.
Well, if you took ADHD medication, you might be disqualified.
Right.
Okay, because you were on, because ADHD is considered a mental illness.
Right.
Okay, and so you don't have it anymore.
Right.
You're not being treated, but you were treated.
Right.
Postpartum depression.
Right.
Another good example of, yes, for this period of time, you were mentally ill. Or what about a person going through a divorce?
Right.
And they're depressed and they're sad and they're angry and they're anxious, and they go to their doctor and they say, hey, look, I need something to help me sleep. Well, it's because you're a little bit depressed right now, so it goes in the diagnosis code. You go in as depressed. You take medication maybe for 2 or 3 months to get through the divorce. Divorce is over, you settle down, you don't need the medication anymore. Should that person get a gun? That person has by definition, that person has a mental illness.
Right. And the ones that really will mess people up a little bit is learning disabilities. Technically speaking, a learning disability is in the
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
Right. And so it is considered a mental health problem, a mental illness.
Right.
There are lots of other things in the DSM, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There are a lot of other conditions in there that I don't think that most people would even recognize or know that were in there.
And just to show you how many there are, 20% of the population has a diagnosable mental illness.
Right.
The population of the United States is 300 million.
Right.
That means there are 60 million of us
Right.
who have a mental illness.
Right.
So if somebody says, let's keep the guns out of the hands of the mentally ill, we're talking about 60 million people.
Right.
So the first question is, do you really want to prevent all 60 million? Now, I know there are people who are going to say, I want to keep guns out of the hands of everybody.
Right.
We understand that, but that's that other...
We talked about that yesterday.
We did that yesterday. We're not going to do that again. But we're talking about 60 million people who are diagnosed. Now, there are many other people who are not diagnosed.
Right.
Okay. But there are 60 million that we know of. Okay. And are you going to deny them what some people would say is a fundamental right to have a gun? That Second Amendment argument, which we'll talk about another day. But are you going to deny all 60 million?
Right.
If you say, well, no, that's stupid, then the next question is, which ones are you going to deny?
Right.
The third question is, how are you going to identify them?
Right.
Okay. When we talk about a complex issue, this is a complex issue.
Right.
Large numbers. So we go from 60 million, and I want to know how you determine which of the 60 million shouldn't be able to buy a gun.
Right.
And how are you going to know?
Right. Yeah, it's far more complicated than we would like to think that it is.
That's right.
Because it's easy to say, because we think about, many people think about mental illness the same way they think about diabetes. Oh, well, that person is diabetic because here's how we know.
Right.
And so that means that this person can or can't do this and that. But mental illness is very, very different than that.
With diabetes, we can do a lab test.
Right.
You do a lab test, and here's the number. Okay. Cholesterol. Here's a number.
Right.
Glucose. Here's a number. There are some lab tests for some disease. We don't have lab tests in our field.
Right.
And the reason they're in DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is there are no lab tests.
Right.
These are clinical judgments that highly trained people are responsible for making.
Right.
I mean, hopefully they're highly trained and ethical, but these are not lab tests. It doesn't matter what it is. There are no neuroimaging techniques. There are no blood tests. There are no urine tests. There's no lab test that will say this person has it.
Right. Yeah. So it comes back to the idea that pointing the finger at mental health or mental illness as that's how we're going to solve this problem. We're going to keep the guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. It raises more questions than it resolves, really. And as you said, we'll talk more about public policy another day. But those people we talked yesterday about the two camps, the two camps of nobody should have guns, and the other camp that everyone should have guns. There are those who believe that everyone should have guns, and that we shouldn't restrict someone just because they have a mental impairment. And I think that. I was thinking about this more after we finish up the podcast yesterday. When a person is in one of those two camps, and they sort of hunker down and they stay there, that ends everything.
Oh, you mean if they stay on their...
If they stay in their...
confirmatory bias.
Right. It stays there. And then there's no way that anything can happen if we stay in those camps.
If you say... I have a constitutional right to own a weapon. Okay? Any weapon.
Right.
Well, that's not true. I'm not allowed to own a machine gun.
Right.
Okay. But let's say I have a constitutional right to own a weapon.
You can't own a machine gun?
No.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Right. So there are limits.
Okay.
I mean, you're not. You can buy semi-automatic, but you're not allowed to own. I mean, citizens aren't allowed to own machine guns.
Okay.
Okay. And so. You have this constitutional right. Who gets denied? It's like free speech. Do you deny a person the right to free speech because they're mentally ill? No. So gun advocates would say, so you don't deny them the Second Amendment either. If you're not going to deny them the first, why would you deny them the second? Okay.
Right.
I understand that argument. I mean, I understand how. I don't agree with it, but I understand why a person would make that argument.
Right.
Okay, I get that. But those are the complexities that we're facing with this issue.
Right. And at some point, on Friday's podcast this week, we're going to be talking about safety. How do we keep people safe and all that. And I think that, that to me is where that piece of the argument comes into play. Saying there are consequences for saying things despite freedom of speech. There are consequences for yelling fire in a packed theater, but that's reactive. You can't prevent someone from going into the movie theater out of concern that they might say fire.
Right.
But the relative danger. Of freedom of speech, relative immediate danger to life for freedom of speech is very different than that when it comes to and even as I'm saying it, I know that there will be someone who will say, but if you go and you say certain things to certain people, that's going to potentially lead to a threat of life.
Now here's another complication. When you say mentally ill, you're immediately entering, because there's been a crime committed, you're immediately entering that issue of sanity.
Right.
Okay, so there's this forensic issue
Right.
of sanity and competence.
Mm-hmm.
We've been struggling with this for 100 years.
Long time. Yeah.
Okay. A person commits a crime. The Menendez brothers shot their parents with a shotgun, killed them in their bed. Are they mentally ill?
Right.
So that's the first question. Okay, well, nobody, I mean, there was nothing about those two boys. There were no diagnoses, never been treated. Okay. They do this act. Does the act make them mentally ill?
Right.
Because if that's the case, then prediction becomes very difficult.
Right.
Because we had those boys didn't do anything prior to this. They weren't loners. They weren't depressed. They weren't drug addicts. They just wanted their parents' insurance money. They were angry about something. So were they mentally ill when they killed their parents? Probably not. I mean, they didn't have a diagnosis at the time. Second question, then were they sane at the time? Well, you have to be insane to do that. Well, I don't know whether I mean...
Well, insanity is a legal term. It's not a
legal
mental
term.
Mental
That's
health
right.
term.
So are we confusing sanity and mental illness?
Right.
Okay. And some people might be confusing those two things, and they shouldn't be, because mental illness is one thing and sanity is another.
Right.
And sanity shouldn't be confused with competence.
Right.
And that's another legal tangle
Right.
that will cause us problems. So I think when people say they're mentally ill, I think what they're saying is they've lost their capacity for reasoning.
Right. I think that's what they mean. But
that's not necessarily a mental illness.
Right.
Now, there are people who have disorders like schizophrenia. If it's untreated, they may not be dealing with reality. But most of those people never commit crimes. Okay, so how do you know? Let's say they all have a thought disorder. Every killer has a thought disorder. That would be the most reasonable assumption, I think, right?
Okay.
Okay, they have a thought disorder.
Sure.
93% of people with thought disorders do not commit crimes.
Right.
So which ones do you deny?
Right.
How do you identify the 7.5%?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And what we're really getting to here, in the sort of a roundabout way, is predictability.
That's right.
The issue is that we're not.
There is no test.
We're not really good at predicting. Trained professionals,
right,
are certainly better than chance.
Yes.
Right. Sort of, if you think about a 50-50 shot at guessing whether or not somebody's going to hurt somebody. But beyond, to know, to be able to predict at a sophistication, at a level sophisticated enough to where you would want to, and you would feel comfortable removing somebody's rights.
Right.
We're not there.
No.
And it's not because the field of mental health is less sophisticated. It's not that we don't understand what's happening. It's that there are so many factors that are involved in why anyone would do any of these things, much less someone who has a mental illness. There are so many factors involved in it that it's not predictable.
No.
I mean, I was just reading some studies yesterday, and when you look at violent offenders, and you're going to put them in even in a jail setting, prison setting, and you want to predict which ones of those prisoners are going to be violent, you can bring a mental health professional in, and some of these people will have mental illness, and some of them will not.
That's right. Right.
We're still not any better at predicting among violent offenders.
Even though they have already committed crimes, we still don't have good predictive capacity.
Right, because we don't know how the interplay between two people are going to influence each other's, and what might exacerbate one problem and what might mute another problem. And so we can't, we talk about unduly removing the rights of somebody, and the ACLU, they would be all over that.
That's right.
If we were working to
in fact, they were. The ACLU joined with the NRA and said, no. You got to be careful about denying people these constitutional rights.
Right.
I mean, there was a case where the NRA and the ACLU, as strange as it seems, were on the same side of an issue.
Right. And so we can't, it's just not good enough to be able to be at a level where you can say, we're going to take those rights away.
I also think that the general public may... where do we get our information? We get it from TV programs and we get it from magazine articles. And when we do our diagnoses, we use things like clinical interviews. We talk to people. We use tests and rating scales and things. Well, we all, in this business, we all know that people can be dishonest when they're filling out a rating scale.
Right.
We have a case in Florida right now where we have a person who committed, we think, committed several murders, the Seminole Heights murders.
Right.
His parents are refusing to speak to authorities because they don't want to jeopardize their son. Right. Okay. Well, if I gave those parents a rating scale who do we give rating scales to? To people who know the person. Who would that be? Teachers, parents, grandparents. If somebody gives me a rating scale for my child,
you're going to be motivated.
I'm going to be
motivated
motivated
one way or another
to do what's best. If I want my child to get services, I'll make my kid look bad. If I want my child not to be accused, I'll make my child look good. The clinician has to work with my ratings.
Right.
Okay. And so this is an inexact science. There is no test, the Rorschach or projectives.
Right.
There's no magic test that we possess that we can give to a person and say, oh, I know this is one of those people.
Right.
We don't have any instruments like that.
Right.
When we say we don't have a lab test, that's what we're saying, is we don't have a test that will say this is a person who will commit murder. Right. It just, that technology simply doesn't exist.
Right. And there's been court proceedings, because I can already hear what some people will say about that. There's already been court proceedings where this has come out and they've talked about it, and they said, well, just because it's not an exact science doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen and that we shouldn't try and that we shouldn't evaluate. Because the reality is that while it's not an exact science, our goal is to look at accumulate as much information as possible, because the more information you have, the more informed your decision will be and your opinion will be, and then you have the preciseness of your opinion is more and more refined the more information you have.
Every once in a while we will have I think the Fort Hood shooter was a good example of this. Okay, so we have this man who commits multiple murders at Fort Hood, at the military base in Fort Hood, Texas. So the first thing that's going to happen is we want to discuss sanity and competence. And so we turn this person over to a forensic psychiatrist or a forensic psychologist who does a large battery of tests. Okay, you take all that information, but what makes the evaluation valid is the experience of the clinician. Right. Because you've done this so many times that you can interpret the data differently. Right. The tests don't answer the question. Right. The tests don't provide you the information. It's the collection, this large collection of information in the hands of an experienced clinician who has done 20 or 50 or 100 or 1,000 of these evaluations across a lifetime. You begin to get some sense of what's going on. Not 100%, and it's not predictive. Well, once again, you're looking at a guy after the fact. Right. Okay.
It's the same thing with investigators. Right. The good investigators are good because they have lots of experience, and they pull, and so they know that, when we see this sign, that tends to lead in this direction.
Which I wouldn't know. I mean,
Right.
I'm not an investigator. I'm not a private investigator. I would look at the same stuff. I wouldn't know what it meant. I wouldn't know that it had meaning.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's, again,
Complex.
it's complex.
Okay, so just like we don't say gun control, you know, this is a problem with gun control. No, it's not also, nor is it a problem of mental illness.
Right.
Okay, it's a mental illness is a complex issue. There are many pieces to this. We need to have the discussion, however. We do want to get better at what we do.
Right.
But it's a discussion that has to occur. How do we do this?
Right.
We don't have that answer. Nobody has that answer right now. But these are questions that should be asked as part of a larger discussion. I think that's the point we're making.
Right. Right. So, all right. That's it for today.
Difficult stuff.
Good stuff. So
Keep talking. Keep the dialogue going.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about public policy, because everybody says it's a policy issue. It's a Second Amendment. It's a
Right.
you know, we're going to talk about that some tomorrow. So until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.
Thank you.